If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the book, The Blueprint, and it is written by Ken Blackwell, who was with us in the first half hour. Ken Kuklowski, who's still with us, constitutional lawyer and journalist who writes quite frequently for FoxNews.com, Washington Examiner, Townhall.com, and others. And Ken, just before we take some phone calls, I thought we might talk a little bit more about constitutional interpretation. And one of the sections you have in one of the chapters has to do with the influence of international law. We've talked about this a little bit on the program, but I think that, again, helps us understand that we do have a Supreme Court and a president, and I would have to say an attorney general in the Justice Department, that want to not just look at American precedents, but want to look overseas. And when they do so, I think it does violence to constitutional interpretation. Explain how.
My goodness, I think you're absolutely right there. And in fact, we just saw it this week when the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case Graham versus Florida, struck down a Florida law allowing for a prison sentence of life in prison without parole for someone under the age of 18. Now, the record showed that there are 38 states, 38 out of 50 states have that law on the books, or at least they did until Monday afternoon. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that only a scant handful of people, usually 16 or 17-year-olds, were ever sentenced to it. And the issue there was because juries take into account the age of the person when they're imposing a sentence. Now, in this case, it was someone who at age 16 had served time in prison for armed robbery, then held a woman at gunpoint and robbed her in her home, and when the police apprehended him, just a couple weeks out of his prison term, apprehended him, found out that in the intervening 2 weeks he had committed other felonies. So when he was brought back before the judge determined him to be someone who could not be rehabilitated, someone who was dead set to live his whole life as a violent felon. And so the maximum punishment was imposed. That was life in prison. When the Supreme Court threw that out this week, they cited to international law. They cited to UN treaties. They looked at the laws of Europe, and it was they talked about the evolving standards of decency in our society, taking into account the international consensus of what is just and fair in a legal system. So that's exactly right. It's so interesting that you raised that, and you're right. We do discuss that in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 of the book. It does tremendous violence to our Constitution because the American people, we are a sovereign people. We have sovereignly adopted a Constitution as our supreme law, and in our Constitution we make it clear that whatever narrow areas of law are not committed to the federal government by the Constitution, those are all retained by the states and the people in the states to sovereignly decide how they are going to run their lives, including what sort of criminal laws and criminal sentences they're going to impose. So we describe and explain in the blueprint how it is that Barack Obama is looking to international law and foreign law that has very different values than we have here in America as a way to radically expand the power of the federal government, including his own power as president.
Again, certain powers delegated, actually 18 enumerated powers delegated to the federal government. The rest are reserved to the states and the people. Kind of basic constitutional 101, but we see that has been changed dramatically. Before we go to the phones, though, I wanted to pick off something else in that chapter because it had to do with what you called the domestic army. And this, now I'm quoting from his chief of staff, but I know he agrees with this as well. Citizenship is not an entitlement program. It comes with responsibility. Everyone somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25 will serve 3 months of basic training and understanding in some kind of civil defense. Now, we can have a debate as to whether or not we should have a draft, whether we can conscript men or women, men and women, whatever, into the military. But he's talking about something that looks to me a lot more like Acorn or like youth camps. And you do address that in the book as well.
We do, and we want to be very careful in doing so because it's easy to go off in a direction that's not supported by the facts. What we're left with as we look at that, statements that you just quoted, Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel. There were statements that the President himself made. There were even statements that the First Lady, Michelle Obama, made. Very, very bizarre statements. And what we say is we don't want to go off on a rabbit trail and maybe get off on a tangent as to what the president is talking about, but we think he owes the country an explanation. What is he talking about when he says that we need a domestic national security force that is as large and as well-funded as our military? Because we have over 1 million people in our military.
Yes.
And the Pentagon's budget is something north of $400 billion a year. I mean, you're talking about staggering resources there. What is the president talking about? We're not alleging anything. We know that the internet is full of rumors as to what's going on with that. And we don't delve into any of that. We just say, let's keep this level-headed. But for goodness sake, what are you talking about, Mr. President? If you're talking about something that involves more than 1 million people and that costs $500 billion a year, you owe the country a full explanation as to what exactly it is you have in mind.
Well, let's take some phone calls. I might just mention in the second hour today, we will actually hear some of the comments that came from Mexican President Felipe Calderon as he spoke today to a joint session of Congress, had comments about immigration, had comments about guns and assault weapons, and much, much more. In our second hour today, we will first hear from President Calderon and then get your comments as well. And if you'd like to join our discussion right now, so we're talking with Ken Klukowski, who is one of the co-authors of the book, The Blueprint. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to another Ken. This Ken is in Texas. Ken, go ahead. You're on with Ken Klukowski.
Gentlemen, thank you for taking my call. I've got a couple of questions. To begin with, yesterday afternoon I was listening to former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and he made a comment that based on some polling and some other research information they had accumulated, that as it stands today, President Obama has less than a 20% chance to be reelected in 2012, which is great news. However, that said, I have two questions. Number one, what organizations of people elected President Obama? And number two, your thoughts on the projection for the 2012 race. Thank you.
Sure. Ken, any comments that you might have for those?
Absolutely. I think that number, unfortunately, is just plucked out of the air. Who's to say that it's 20% versus 40%? Versus 10% versus 2%. There is no scientific basis for that. I think it's a good way to get you on camera to talk about your new book, but there's no objectively verifiable method where a third party could reproduce some sort of study and come up with a number like 20%. I think we have no way of knowing what the odds are that President Obama will be reelected in 2012, in large part because of what we discuss in chapters 6 and 8 of our book,
right,
in terms of how he's seeking to change the electoral process, changing who can vote, trying to grant amnesty to 12 million illegals in this country, which would give him between 7 and 10 million new voters that he would count on to vote by a 10-to-1 ratio for him. And also, as we talk about in Chapter 8, his work to try and silence opposition voices, to destroy talk radio, to shut down shows like this, in fact. And all of that could radically change how elections are conducted in this country and what information the voters would have access to be able to decide what they do. So I thought it was an unnecessary soundbite because there's no way that you can assess that. There's no secret knowledge by which you can divine that the odds are 20%. But I think. And in fact, I think there's a danger in that as well. When you're running for public office, even if you're ahead in the polls, you still run like you're down by 10 points, because otherwise you can slack up and the other guy can get ahead of you. I'm concerned that by people saying that the odds are overwhelming that the president won't be reelected, that it could lull millions of Americans to relax and think that they don't need to be fighting right here, right now, for their country, because that's a big part of why we wrote the book. If everyone thinks they just need to hold tight for 2 years and then vote for someone else for president, and that's going to fix everything, I think that ignores the vast areas of irreversible damage where this president can enact things in an agenda that could not be undone.
Well, and again, I don't quote from Ann Coulter very often, but her column that came out yesterday, Republicans snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, she was talking about the harm that is done when people are predicting that Republican would win in Pennsylvania 12 and things of that nature. I think some of those predictions, first of all, are very premature, and second of all, might cause individuals to put it into cruise control or autopilot instead of paying attention to the issues. So we'll come back, and when we come back, I want to talk just for a second about those elections, because in Chapter 6, you have 5 different reasons why you think President Obama might be able to manipulate the election cycle. Most of those are ones we've talked about, but when you get them all together, it's pretty interesting. So we'll come back and talk about that and take some more calls right after this.